Now, former Weapons Inspector David Kay on threats he sees to the nation's security. He speaks at a conference of law enforcement, security, and emergency management professionals. It's about 50 minutes.
Good afternoon. I am Tamara Christian. I am the president of National Trade Productions, and we are the producers of GovSec, U.S. Law, and Ready, and we thank all of you for being here today. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. David Kay. In 2003, Dr. Kay was appointed by the director of the CIA to lead the 1,400-member Iraq survey group. In January 2004, Dr. Kay's team concluded and reported that there had been no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq at the time of the start of the war. These findings led to congressional hearings and the appointment of an independent commission to investigate the causes of the U.S. intelligence failings prior to the war, as well as how the intelligence was communicated and used by policymakers. Currently, Dr. Kay is a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. He also serves as an analyst for NBC and for MSNBC. Please give Dr. Kay a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I particularly appreciate the introduction. As I've told you and others at times, I view introductions as probably the most dangerous thing I've ever done in my life. Occasionally, you even do it to yourself. My favorite example is, now it's over 20 years ago, I was asked to go to Egypt to accompany a group of U.S. doctors who were examining the Egyptian health system. They decided at the last moment they should have someone who knew something about Egypt and who knew something about the Third World area, and so I was asked to go. And I was told, well, I could explain my presence by saying I was an economist. Well, we got in, and as typical in these delegations, the first thing you do is you sit down for a large dinner. You literally get off the airplane, and they take you to a place, and the minister is hosting a dinner. And you're paired up, in this case, with Egyptian health professionals, logically. The doctor opposite me said, and Dr. Kay, what is your specialty? And I said, well, I'm an economist, because that's how it was decided to describe me. And he looked at me and he said, we used to have those in this country, but President Nasser had them all killed. There were two thoughts that ran through my mind. A, I was going to have to reevaluate my feelings about President Nasser. He was a wiser ruler than I'd given him credit for. And second, I was going to have a very long discussion if I got back with the individual who decided it would be good to describe me as an economist. It probably wasn't a friend, as I thought. And about 10 minutes later, conversation carried on, but 10 minutes later, the Minister of Health, who was down the table, slammed his hand down and said, Dr. Kay, I understand you're a communist. Then the penny dropped. That's the problem of being a Texan. Sometimes your accent gets in the way. And I said, no, not quite as dangerous, just an economist. And he said, oh. And, oh was not an endorsement, but it was slightly better than being a communist. So I'm happy, Tamara, to have survived that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Just a quick walk through the floor. First, the exhibits seem extraordinarily good, but I also, and for me it's more important, the people I met. There are several here who are people who were with me in Iraq, with me in the very literal sense. They provided the close-in protection day in and day out. I've learned firsthand the importance of professionals in the security field. I'm glad to see so many of them here, so I'm happy to be here. There's another reason for being happy to be here. Those of you who are from the Washington area or follow national politics understand this is a peculiar season, and anytime you can be with a group of people who have to be rational because of your profession, you're better off than being around the rest of the people in Washington. I mean, I've sort of got used to, at this time of the year, all my friends are writing op-ed pieces to call attention to themselves so that whatever administration gets in, they may get a job. I must say this is the first year in which I've seen a former national security advisor tried to add to his resume the capability of being the director of Central Intelligence by going out and stuffing documents into his boxers. You know, to show that you can surreptitiously remove documents, or in this case, if you get caught removing them, you can create so much confusion about how you did it. You really salt the mine with it. Again, reinforces this is really the dangerous, silly season in Washington. So I am happy to be here with so many professionals who, by training and survival, have to think in a cool, calculating, rational way. What I'd like to do today is actually not look backwards, but look forwards. I think we're in an extraordinary time in our nation's history. If you think about it, there have only been 3 occasions, and the present is the 3rd occasion, in which we've had to change our national security strategy. From 1776 to 1914, we had one dominant national security strategy: keep the big powers of the rest of the world out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, we took a multitude of courses to do this. Money helped in the case of the Louisiana Purchase. Alliances helped at various times. Warnings even helped. But it worked by and large. That strategy gave way in 1914 to a recognition that what happened in the rest of the world, particularly the balance of power in Europe, was crucial to American survival. And from 1914 up until 9/11, our policy was dominated by maintaining a friendly world in which our enemies did not control Central Europe and European resources, and we were able to ward off attacks by being concerned about the balance in the rest of the world. 9/11 really starts another period, and it's a period without a good name. I'm afraid, at least temporarily, we're going to think of it as the age of terrorism. I happen to think that's not the dominant root threat to national security. Terrorism, just like weapons of mass destruction, which have dominated a large portion of my life, are means and tactics. There is something else going on in the world that has a root cause. And if we're going to protect ourselves, if people like you are going to be able to perform your job as effectively as you have to, you've got to understand not just the tactics of the opponents. You need to understand what is driving the opponents and what's causing it. So I would like to take a little time today, and it will be little, it's a complex subject to try to cover, by looking at what I think are the root causes of our national security problem for the next generation. And first of all, I think we need to start with what I would call vulnerable societies or failed states. If you look around the world today and you use UN or non-governmental data, you can easily identify 50 to 70 states that either are not making it or are on the very cusp of not making it as states. These range from the Somalis, the Sudans, the Koreas, Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea, to the Pakistanis, to the Indonesians, across most of Africa, to the Haitians in our own hemisphere. States that simply, for one reason or the other, have failed to maintain the organizational structure that allows normal life to carry on in those societies. We need to understand why these states are failing. And they're not all failing for the same reasons, although the results, I think, are fundamental to the insecurity of this next stage of the nation's national security policy. Let me try to just lay out 3 or 4 of the major reasons I think they're failing, because I think they're relevant to the task you're going to be asked to perform. They're certainly relevant to the type of intel structure we need to understand them. First of all, a number of these states are under absolutely extraordinary demographic pressures. In Western Europe and in the United States, for most of our recent history at least, the percent of your population under 15 years old has been around 17%. Let me just contrast that with the region where I've spent the last year of my life. In Iraq, 62% of the population is under 15 years of age. In Yemen, it's 50% is under. In the Middle East as a whole, it's 35% is under 15. And if you slightly change that to what I think is actually, although demographers don't always use it, a more relevant cut, that is 24 years of age. You've got over half the population in the Middle East are under 24. Now, the reason that's relevant is if you think in your own family, those of you who have had or currently have teenage kids, this is the period of maximum dynamic stress. They need education. They have demands for health. They have demands ultimately, and in many cases it's not ultimately, right away, for employment and jobs. And if they don't have it, they have so little stake, and some of us as parents might say so little judgment, that in fact they're willing to undertake extraordinarily risky acts without thinking of the consequences. They're social dynamite. And in large chunks of the world today, we have significant groups of the population in individual countries that are at 50% or more in that age group. Now, it's also changing the shape of many of those regions. My favorite factoid of the moment is a country that in many ways is beautiful from a National Geographic sense, but is a disaster in almost any other sense, and that's Yemen. Yemen is a country without an economy unless you call the growing collection and distribution of the narcotic weed khat an economic system. And yet, at mid-century, Yemen is going to be the second largest country in the Middle East. A country without an economy, a country without an education system, a country without an economy that can produce jobs for over 100 million. Demographers estimate about 105 million in Yemen at mid-century. Any wonder as you look around Al-Qaeda, you're already seeing a large proportion of Yemenis providing the foot soldiers of terrorism already. Now, the second reason is economic. We complain, and with some justification, we're concerned about our own economic status and the fluctuations of the job market, the stock market, 401k accounts in the United States, without recognizing that in at least 70 countries of the world, the economic situation today is very, very difficult, to be polite about it. In a wide swath of Africa, the per capita income today is lower than it was at the point where colonialism ended in 1960s. Even in the country that, for many of us in our mind, is the stereotype of great wealth, Saudi Arabia. The Arabian Nights jump to mind, the extraordinary wealth and abuses of that wealth over the last decade or two that we can all think of, spending of money. We don't think of Saudi Arabia as a poor state. The per capita income in Saudi Arabia today, as compared to 1972, remember 1972 and gas lines? Some of you are like me, old enough to remember that. Saudi Arabia per capita income today is about 60% less than it was 25 years ago. Now think of what that means personally. That means for the children today in Saudi Arabia, they are not going to have the income, the economic future, the wealth that their elder brothers, their uncles, and their fathers had. It's a tremendous and sudden decompression of economic wealth into something that is far, far different. And this can be, it's in many places of the world. We forget how many countries depend on a single crop or a single resource, a condition that makes you vulnerable to economic fluctuations. And in fact, in most of these 50 to 70 countries, their economic situation today is much worse. They also, most of them, lack the educational and health systems that are necessary for social stability and to give people a anchor, a stake in the future that allows one to view it worth participating in the social and political life of those countries. You look at Pakistan. Pakistan is a country with an army, but without an education system. Pakistan followed independence with a strange form of the British education model, that is a few good private schools for the wealthy elite, and they walked away from public education. Turn the education over to the mosque, and you get the system of the Madras education system today, which is a recruiting mechanism from the most radical form of Islamic jihadism. You also have, in many of these countries, and this is, I think, at the key central of what's happening in these countries, a failure of social integration. If you think about the 50 to 70 countries ranging across, take the DPRK, North Korea, really a medieval society across Pakistan, Indonesia, much of Africa, you've got countries that are being asked in a generation to make a jump from a pre-modern society in most of their daily lives to a modern, integrated, highly competitive global society. Think how difficult that is, and we've done it much slower in our own cases. Go into South Carolina, go into Louisiana, go into much of the South, or go into the Midwest where the family farm is in the process of disappearing. The South for textile workers, where in fact global competition has changed their very life within a generation, and how hard that is to do in a supportive, adaptive society like our own. Or if you are, like noticing some of the vendors, some of my friends from the IT industry, look at what happens when you discover you can go to places in India and get software designers at an eighth, a tenth, a 20th of the cost that you can in Silicon Valley, and the jerk that makes in your life and in your industry. It is nothing compared to the failure of social integration in places like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Indonesia, and many of these states. We also have, in many of these states, huge migratory fluctuations that are almost like the migratory fluxes of the animal population. Single crops fail, droughts occur, and populations come across borders. Civil war occurs, and populations come across borders. And they come across borders into states that do not have the infrastructure to handle them. And finally, many of these states, of the 50 and 70 that are the most vulnerable, have been the sites of previous conflicts. Civil wars in Rwanda, the Sudan, Somalia, which in fact you never resolve the hurt, the danger, the damage of the previous one, and it makes you much more vulnerable for the next one. And some of them are poised at those points in the environment where hurricanes and other natural disasters, just inevitably with the social structure they have, lead to collapse. This is all well and good, but why is it a national security issue? Why should we, and more importantly, why do you, if you're in the field of Homeland Security, actually have to worry about it? And I think there are 4 or 5 reasons. First of all, radical Islamic jihadism. That is the failure of the state to take hold as an effective organization across the swath of territory running from the Maghreb, the Middle East, through Pakistan into Indonesia. The failure of the state structure to integrate into a concept that will hold the loyalty and dynamicism of a population has allowed the most perverted radical form of Islamic jihadism to take root. And they're coming after us because they believe we are at fault. That is a result not of a love of terrorism, but a result of a failure of the state system across a large swath of the world. The second reason, and certainly it's true for those of you who are involved with the U.S. military, is humanitarian crises. You take, since the end of the Cold War, if you take sort of the first President Bush's administration, the U.S. military was intervening in humanitarian crises at the rate of about once every 2 years, a disaster that would involve the deployment of the portions, and usually a small portion, of the American military. You go through the Clinton administration and into President George W. Bush's administration. We're now intervening about twice a year. We're now at the point where, for example, in the Sudan, we're about to have another military intervention in the name of dealing with a humanitarian crisis. With 50 to 70 failed states, let me tell you, that becomes the norm. With the television cameras that we have around, with our personal involvement in which the horrible conditions, for example, in Darfur in the Sudan, are in front of you every day. You just cannot avoid intervention. And so as a national security issue, our whole national security structure is going to have to be shaped
in part to deal not only with radical jihadism, but with the increased necessity of dealing with humanitarian crises. There's also a third national security reason, and we've seen some of that this summer. Disruption in key resources and trade patterns. A strike in Nigeria because the Nigerian oil field workers and others thought they were not getting a fair shake. And strike disruption in Venezuela for many of the same reasons is one of the major contributors to the spike in oil prices over this summer. If you look around how dependent we have become on global trade and global resource flows, and you realize how many of those resource flows either come from or pass through the territory of states that essentially are now either failed and should be in Chapter 11, bankruptcy, or in fact are so vulnerable that their failure is almost assured and all you're talking about is the timing, you realize our own economic dependence and consequently our own national security that is involved in that. Refugee flux is certainly true as another, refugee flux has become national security crisis. If you doubt me, look at Florida. I hesitate to say look at Florida and thought about it in an election year because if you look at Florida, you can see a lot of lessons, not only refugee crisis, but look, the Haitian flux is an immediate security issue in Florida. The fall of Castro, particularly if it's a messy flow, a refugee flux across the Florida Straits. Those of us who come from the southwest of the United States understand the issue of migratory refugee flow across state borders and the demands that puts on us for homeland protection and homeland security. And the final aspect in which it becomes one is one that is a really fundamental change in our world, and it has occurred so suddenly, I suspect most of us don't give it a thought. And that is, most everyone in this room grew up in an age in which you had to wrestle with the knowledge or the issue of the Soviet Union having missile subs off the coast of the United States that in 12 to 15 minutes meant they could rain down tremendous thermonuclear power on the United States, or from the missile fields of central Russia, 30 minutes, only slightly longer, could rain down thermonuclear destruction on our civilization. And we could do the same to the Soviets. But think about it today. The things that will threaten American national security no longer require the resources of a superpower to reach us. If you can afford an airplane ticket, or if you can stow yourself away on a ship, or even worse, if you can pack a shipping container that comes into U.S. ports, you probably have the capability of threatening U.S. national security. And that means that it is here and it is not there. We have, at least in the first two national security periods of our country, republic, worrying about national security. The period when we wanted to keep the great powers out of the Western Hemisphere. The second period where we wanted to be concerned about the balance of power, not really in the rest of the world, but in Europe. We worried about an enemy that was over there. I know I'm talking to the church choir, but I think very few of you, your fellow citizens, recognize it. Every day, your life, your profession is on the line because the potential enemy is not over there, it's over here. And that is going to make a difference as to how we deal with national security in the coming generation. There are, of course, other reasons, and these other reasons are not unimportant. And let me just briefly skate over them, not because I think they're unimportant, but simply as a matter of time. There are remnants of the Cold War and the Second World War that every day threaten the breakout of war and conflict. Certainly the North Korea-South Korea border is one that every day when you turn on the radio, flip on the television in the morning as you're getting up, no one should be surprised if that comes with the news of a security crisis and a conflict there. One that we think less of, but probably is not that much less significant or likely, is the Taiwan Straits. In fact, I imagine if you did a survey of the general American public, Taiwan, the answer would be, where's that? And the answer would be, what's the origin of it? It is a remnant of the Cold War, the end of the Second World War, that indeed still offers the danger of an immediate security crisis. And I would add, of course, the same is true of Israel and its neighbors. Always possible. I think not as key to the next generation as the failure of the state system, so the widespread failure of the state system, but one that we have to deal with. There are two other broad classes which we really don't have time to do with, and I actually think most of them will be reflected in causing states to fail. And that is competition for resources, particularly water and oil, which will show up with tremendous pressure on some states as they simply can't cope with the issue of having not enough resources for their population base. And the other is widespread transnational issues of health and agriculture, global climate change. You've seen an opening of that, although most Americans have not seen as much as Europeans have seen. Let me tell you, the whole southern swath of Africa today is in failure and on the verge of unbelievable chaos because of AIDS. You're wiping out the educated population. For example, if you take Zambia, 40% of the teachers, doctors, and civil servants today have HIV. If you look at South Africa, the impact of AIDS on South Africa is putting South Africa back at least a decade already and on the cusp of failure unless it comes to terms with how to deal with it. You saw very briefly, and actually you saw, I thought, a very strong and appropriate reaction from the country that realized how threatening disease could have been a year ago. Anyone notice how the Chinese reacted to the outbreak of SARS? It was not only a public health response, it was a security response, recognizing that rampant disease like SARS could threaten the very foundation of the People's Republic of China and the rule of the Communist Party in China. I suspect that endemic diseases are likely to become the widest cause of immediate state failure, and it may hit, as SARS was an opening wedge, it may hit countries that we think of as too large to fail. They are not too large to fail under some impact, and that will become a national security issue not only for them but for us. I'd like to very quickly deal with what I dismissed, and I didn't really mean to dismiss it, as tactics and means, because I think they've changed, and they've changed in really fundamental ways. First, weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction and the concern of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, really goes back in the American political system to President Eisenhower and was taken up by President Kennedy as a major issue. What's changed? Because I think the weapons proliferation issue no longer is the problem that was seen by President Eisenhower or President Kennedy. President Eisenhower and Kennedy were worried about the proliferation of weapons to states who would do it by creating or recreating the weapons programs that the superpowers had. And they were mostly worried about them being creeping into the hands of large states. We forget that back when John Kennedy referred to the problem, the immediate concern was China, states like Taiwan, the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, Japan. States are pretty substantial. That has all changed. What has changed today is that the capabilities have become so widespread, the ability to get those weapons has become so general that there are largely a trivial issue, and this is particularly true in the chemical and biological area, for every state and even for substantial groups. And let me just pause a bit to give you a biographical example so this doesn't seem so abstract. And some of you will guess the name before I give it to you, but let me give you the biohistory of one of the most interesting people on the international scene in the last 5 years. An individual who was born in Bhopal, India in the 1930s. That was an India that was ruled by the British, colonial India. In the 1950s, after Indian independence, actually almost 8 years after Indian independence and the split of Pakistan, Bangladesh from India, he ended up with his parents moving to Pakistan, finished high school in Pakistan, took a government fellowship and went to Germany, superb engineering student in one of the better German universities at Karlsruhe. Went to work for a multinational company composed of the British, German, and Dutch that was involved in the enrichment of uranium. He was the type of employee that if there are any of you involved in industrial security in this room, you'll recognize they're your ultimate nightmare because you worry about them and yet their bosses think they're the best thing to come along since sliced bread. This individual worked nights, he worked weekends, he took work home, he was always seeking out assignments outside of his area and wanting to perform well. Those of you concerned, you don't want an individual like that in your financial area. You're likely to have someone who's cooking the books. But what this individual did is 2 years after the first Indian nuclear explosion, he went back home to Pakistan and created the foundations of the Pakistan nuclear program. The individual's A.Q. Khan, if you haven't guessed that already. A.Q. Khan then, within 10 years of doing that, was offering for $100 million a pop a complete package of nuclear weapon technology. Everything from enriching uranium to a very workable bomb design to assistance in acquiring the delivery systems themselves. And he did it in the most amazing way. Take the case of Libya, which has been fairly well described in the open press. You're Libyans, you want centrifuges, but you don't have the manufacturing capability? Not a problem. We'll set up a company for you in Malaysia, they'll produce them, and we'll air freight them to you. In fact, if you look at the A.Q. Khan model of working, it looks a lot like Amazon.com. And it looks a lot like Sam's Club or Costco. And that's what you have to really worry about. In the case of Iraq, you had countries who were offering technological assistance to the regime of Saddam Hussein across the range of its weapons programs, particularly in the missile program, that would send people for 6 months to Baghdad, and then they'd go back home and they'd run their support services using the internet. Now, why is this something that ought to worry everyone in this country? Because if you were to go in American pharmaceutical companies today, if you were to go in the American chemical industry, if you were to go in nuclear engineering programs in American universities, and you look around you, you'd see a lot more foreign students than most of you would guess. And yet we don't worry very much about our industrial security as much as we should, given that we are tremendously vulnerable. And what it really means is the capabilities are out of the bag. Anyone who believes you can control information related to the production of chemical and biological or even nuclear weapons by simply operating a better security system has not looked at the real cases of how information flows around us. So what I'm really saying is that we have got to change fundamentally, and this will actually be the challenge of the next administration, to change our weapons control policy from one that was concerned with capabilities, of limiting capabilities and understanding capabilities, to one that is much more concerned with intentions, motivations, plans, and actual activities. Second, it relates also to us. America is an open, democratic, pluralist society. That's what makes us great. We live in a world, we run our enterprises in a way that we don't think we could be what we are without being anything else. I would argue that within the lifetime of everyone in this room, you're going to see a direct challenge to that where we start to worry increasingly about whether those very characteristics which have been our strength in the past are not our greatest vulnerability in the future. And it is the challenge of professionals like you to figure out how, in fact, we do not let that grow from an increasing fear to a reality, because it really would fundamentally change our society. But you're going to see it clearest in the weapons proliferation area immediately. Terrorism, you've already had some discussion, so I really will skip in the interest of allowing time for questions over terrorism. Let me just say that here again, there's been a fundamental sea change. For most of us that spent part of our careers worrying about terrorists, the classic model was the IRA. People who wanted not to destroy societies, but wanted to take over societies and governments. Terrorism today has fundamentally changed. The motivations have changed. They're no longer interested in taking over societies. The the chant you hear when you go to the hellholes of the world, whether you're talking about the refugee camps in Gaza, whether you're talking about Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers and the problems there, and other places across the world, is I die, therefore I am. My life only gains meaning because I am dead. The willingness to run extraordinary risk, self-sacrifice. And what's not recognized very widely, but should be, if you think back and you look at the hijackers of 9/11, or you look at the perpetrators of the Madrid bombing, these were not the desperate kids who had no access to a future. These were mostly middle-class kids who had fellowships and who in fact could have on their own have made their way in modern society. But because of the desperation they were surrounded by, felt so alienated from a future that they gave up their own personal future to the commitment of a cause that involved the destruction of our own society. You combine that with new capabilities that allow them to threaten mass, not so much mass destruction as mass casualties, and you have a very different change in that. Now, I'd like to deal just finally with two things, and that's one that I feel very deeply about, and it's a major source of some of the work my personal work that I'm doing now, and that's the intel system, and finally the overall approach. We are living with an inherited intel system which our country has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in, which was designed to monitor capabilities. We came out of Pearl Harbor committed to never allowing another state to gain the capability to strike us without our knowing about that capability. With the addition of the nuclear age, we settled into a relationship with our principal opponent, the Soviet Union, in which each side understood that it was in a capabilities-driven arms race, and one that increasingly both sides realized was futile. But we geared an intelligence system to watch, stare at the capabilities of the Soviets so they would not gain a surprise in capabilities, and they did the same to us. And we did this on a relatively narrow focus, mostly with regard to the capabilities in the strategic nuclear matrix, not in many other areas. In fact, if you really want a cause to be concerned, think about how often, despite the fact we were spending hundreds of billions of dollars on intel capability focused on a single target, we were surprised when the Soviets took actions that were not in the strategic nuclear area. And just to give you some examples, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, 1967. The invasion of Afghanistan, the trauma that Jimmy Carter had over, how could something so improbable as that occur without any intelligence warning? Even in the strategic nuclear area, when the Soviets acted out of type and did not involve large amounts of material, for example, the placement of nuclear warheads and missiles in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we didn't do a very good job. Now, we have gone, and the Soviets in many ways, we often forget, Soviets were an ideal target, a huge continental power, a power which, in fact, you could be wrong by 100 about the number of Soviet aircraft that were being produced out of a factory, and it really didn't matter in the total balance of capabilities. They had to communicate, and they had to communicate across great distances. And we developed the technologies and the courage of our operators to penetrate that system and to understand it. We indeed have analysts that I'm convinced who knew more about Soviet strategic systems than any one Soviet knew about it. But we have gone from that world to a very different world. A world of denied territories to a world of denied minds, denied networks, small individuals where capabilities don't matter. If you ask the question of who has the capability to make a biological or chemical weapon capable of killing everyone in this vast hall, the list is essentially endless. What you have to know, what you need knowledge and intelligence about, are motivations, intentions, plans, actions that are about to be underway. That's a very, very different intelligence system than a capabilities-driven intelligence system. Now the good news, if you like a challenge, and it's a challenge that many people in this room ought to take on directly for various reasons. First, it's in the national interest, and second, it's going to make someone a hell of a lot of money. And that is, if you look back at the technical giants of my generation, of the people I look up to and admire, the people who imagined, and most of technology, the real challenge of technology, as you know, it's not in the doing, it's the imagining of what can be done. The jump to outer space, the Corona project, the follow-on keyhole satellite system, these were giants of science and technology. There are people today and in the generation ahead who will stand shoulder to shoulder with them because they will be able to envisage and then create the technology that will allow us to understand what small groups are doing, what their plans, motivation, capabilities, and actions are. Those technologies need to be developed. And to give you just a clue as to where I think you'll go, we have spent more than 30 years going further and further out to be able to stare over boundaries. We now need the technologies that allow us to get close in. I would say, I do not think the 15 dinosaurs of the current Intel community will be the people who will develop those technologies at the pace we need them. Either that system must be broken, or that those technologies need to come, as I suspect they will, not from a government system, not even probably from a government private partnership, although I would like that to occur, and I think that's probably the fastest route. They're likely to come directly out of the private sector of people who understand the need to do this and go ahead and do it and then have to transfer it to someplace in the Intel community. But we need, and let me just take one example of it, the communication area. We have invested billions of dollars in vacuuming everything out of the ether. In fact, we vacuum so much out that we generally don't understand the data. That is, we don't turn the data into information until after events like 9/11. But that's not the real challenge. The real challenge today is going to be close in. I need to know what 4 of you are discussing in a hotel room at 7 p.m. tonight. And I need to know it and understand that I need to be in that hotel room, or I need to be able to tap into that hotel room and get there, and I need to do that in a global forum. The new technologies are going to have to be technologies that enable operators to carry out actions that, in fact, operators have not been able, not had to carry out through the entire Cold War. There's tremendous technical frontier out there, and it needs to be driven there. And finally, let me deal just very quickly, so I can leave 15 minutes or so for questions, and that is the approach. In the period of the Cold War, the Soviets and the United States both had a capabilities arms race that they engaged in. And we developed a capabilities intel system designed to look at it. And from that, we got a fair degree of stability. Ultimately, though, it was social and economic factors that bankrupted the Soviet Union and caused it to collapse. And let me just say, as much as I value, and I really do mean, I value this both on the professional level, but I value it personally. I see people in this room who I know have protected my life and were willing to sacrifice their own life to do it. While I value the skills and dedication all of you bring to the job, there is not enough money in the U.S. economy if we solely focus on defense. Not only will it bankrupt us, it ultimately will not work. We need to invent and operationalize both a diplomatic strategy and an intel capability that allows us to shape that battlefield of failed states. So we reduce the challenges you have to face. We will never eliminate them. But if we go ahead with 50 to 70 states, representing roughly a half to 70% of the world's population in abject failure, you're not going to be able to defend us, and we're not going to be able to afford it. We need to think about how we develop the capability to understand what is happening in those states and to shape the battlefield. Now, we also have some characteristics. We can't do it by ourselves. We need to develop intel capabilities that are absolutely oxymoron to what most of us have thought intel capabilities ought to be in the past. They need to be widely shareable. They need to be credible. And particularly coming out of Iraq, that is a high order task. They need to be reliable. They need to be something that allows an administration to shape a shareable international agenda that addresses the despondency and the failure, the lack of social integration, the economic plight and the social and the humanitarian plight of these countries, so that that battlefield becomes a more benign battlefield. And that is the challenge of the next generation. And if we do not meet that, there are not enough people in this profession that you represent, nor enough money to afford the technologies that you see through this hall, as inadequate as they are and will have to be to the emerging broadening of that threat. So we need a two-front approach. We certainly need to address the defense issue. We need to make ourselves as a nation better. But we also need to shape that intel and diplomatic. We need to shape the intel in part so it serves what it does not serve now very well. It does not serve the local responders. It does not serve state and local responders, and it does not serve most people out of the narrow defined national security cone well. But it also does not serve us to get allies to shape the battlefield of the failed states. So that really is the challenge of the next administration, whoever that may be. I'd be happy to take questions at this point. I think there's a microphone, which probably is only one in this room, that's necessary if you want to charge either two here. Challenge the microphone so everyone else can hear you. Otherwise, you open yourself up to my distortion of what you ask, and it'll always be a favorable distortion for me. No questions? Hey, well, just step up and don't wait for me to call on you. Grab a mic. Shaping the battlefield involves grabbing the microphone.
I'm Lou Perlman with the Institute for Defense Analyses. You covered such a wide swath of ideas that I'm almost embarrassed to suggest I think I heard a dog that didn't bark. And I don't mean this as a criticism, but really a personal impression or speculation that I'd like to know your reaction to. In addition to all of that, I've noticed lately what seems to me to be a more entangled or diffuse relationship between criminal enterprise and terror enterprise. We see this in the news from Iraq now more and more. Who are these guys? Are these guys true believers in a cause, or are they just out to get money by kidnapping people?
No, it's a good question, Lou, and it's actually one that you didn't have to wait for Iraq. Those of you involved with Kosovo and Bosnia, we saw it there. Those involved with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the criminal enterprise there, the tie-ins with the Colombian narco traders as both, not because they believed in the goals of terrorists, but as a money-making enterprise is actually one of the more dramatic ones. And in fact, we've been pretty lucky in the United States. I've always said if I want to smuggle a weapon of mass destruction in the United States, I'm going to the guys who smuggle marijuana in. There are two reasons. One is a technical reason and one is a logistic reason. They know exactly their percent of getting things through. I can understand percentage. The other is that marijuana is a damn good shielder because of the oils of neutron emissions, so it actually works pretty effectively there. No, the tie-up, that is a tie-up. The dog didn't bark simply because I compressed a number of things in trying to do with it. It's actually something I think we all need to work more. It's also one of the things that's directly relevant to conceptualizing how you share intelligence with local responders. So much of what we see, and this is a Washington danger, we feds have got to help you poor guys at the local level. Listen, if you want information on criminals, you're better off talking to local cops than you are talking to the FBI in most cases. Because that's where the real information, the real penetrations are. It is a two-way flow, and we've got to structure an intel system that allows that to happen. I'm being jerked.
Sorry about that. I apologize that we don't have time for any more questions, but if you all could join me, thank you for the very intriguing and thought-provoking presentation. It was excellent. Thank you.
Ain't nothing to go to till talker. Thank you. I appreciate it. Walk back to the